It was an ordinary Saturday morning when I decided to check on my boathouse by the lake. The peaceful serenity of the water, the familiar creak of the dock, and the scent of fresh pine always made it my favorite spot to unwind. But that day, something was off. As I approached, I noticed the boathouse door was slightly ajar, a detail that immediately sent a chill down my spine. I had never left it unlocked. Heart pounding, I pushed the door open, and to my astonishment, there she was. Karen from the HOA board, comfortably settled inside my boathouse. Karen had no right to be there. This was my private property, a personal retreat that I valued deeply. She looked up, startled but unrepentant, as if she had every right to invade my space without permission. "Karen, what are you doing in my boathouse?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rush of anger and disbelief. She shrugged, casually brushing off the intrusion. "I thought it was abandoned," she said. "I needed a place to stay for a few days." The audacity stunned me. How could she just move in without any notice or permission? And from what I'd learned later, this wasn't an isolated incident. Karen had been exercising a disturbing level of control over homeowners' properties under the guise of HOA enforcement. As the police chief in this community, I knew a thing or two about trespassing laws. But this wasn't just a random act by a stranger. This was an elected HOA official overstepping boundaries and violating my rights. I asked her to leave immediately, but Karen insisted she had the right, citing some vague HOA rules and her self-appointed authority. The confrontation escalated quickly, with neighbors hearing the commotion and gathering around. Some were shocked by Karen's behavior. Others seemed to silently support her, blinded by their allegiance to the HOA. This was the beginning of a saga that would pit me not only against Karen, but the entire HOA system that allowed such abuse of power. In this chapter, I recount that initial discovery, the shock, the confrontation, and the dawning realization that my private sanctuary was no longer safe. Little did Karen know she was about to meet her match. After the shock of finding Karen in my boathouse wore off, the reality settled in. This was not just an accident or a misunderstanding. Karen's intrusion was a blatant violation of my property rights, and it was clear she expected to stay put, no matter my objections. The question now was how to set firm boundaries, both for her and the HOA, without escalating the conflict beyond control. I stood at the threshold of the boathouse, arms crossed, eyes locked on Karen as she casually sipped a cup of coffee she'd brought with her. The audacity stung. This was my private space, a place I had built and maintained with care over the years, and here she was acting like it was hers. "Karen," I said firmly, "you have no right to be here. This is private property. I'm asking you to leave now." She smirked, putting down her cup. "The HOA has rules about property maintenance, and this boathouse was in disrepair. I'm just helping out." "Helping out? By moving in without permission?" "That's trespassing," I shot back. "You don't get to decide what's best for my property without consulting me first." Karen's tone shifted slightly, trying to wield her HOA status like a shield. "We have responsibilities to the community. Sometimes that means making tough calls." I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "Your job is to enforce rules, not to invade people's homes or take unilateral actions. If there's an issue, the proper channel is to notify the homeowner, not show up and claim their space." The tension was thick. Neighbors began to gather outside, whispering and watching the exchange. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed eager for drama. I knew this confrontation was about more than just a boathouse. It was a power play, an assertion by Karen and the HOA to exert control over residents in ways that exceeded their authority. "I'm the police chief of this town," I reminded her quietly but firmly. "I know the laws and your limits. Don't make me enforce them on you." Karen's expression faltered for a split second, perhaps a flicker of doubt, but she quickly masked it with defiance. Reluctantly, she agreed to leave that day, but warned that the HOA would be keeping an eye on my property. The message was clear. This wasn't over. As she walked out, I realized that setting boundaries was only the first step in what would become a prolonged battle over respect, authority, and the rights of homeowners. But I wasn't backing down. After that tense first confrontation with Karen, it became clear I needed to understand and assert my legal rights more thoroughly. As a police chief, I'm familiar with law enforcement and public safety, but private property disputes, especially involving an HOA, come with their own set of rules and complications. The intrusion into my boathouse was more than a personal affront. It was a violation of my property rights protected by law. But navigating the complexities of HOA covenants, state property statutes, and local ordinances required a careful approach. I started by pulling the property deed and the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and Rs. The deed clearly outlined the boundaries of my property, including the land and structures, like my boathouse. The HOA's rules, however, were a different matter. While they aimed to maintain the neighborhood's aesthetics and standards, some rules were vague or overly broad, which Karen seemed to exploit. One key point was that the HOA has no authority to occupy or seize a homeowner's property without permission or due process. Their power lies primarily in enforcing community rules, issuing fines, or taking legal action after following proper procedures, not in physically invading private spaces. I consulted with a property lawyer to clarify the limits of HOA power and the legal protections I had as a homeowner. We discussed trespassing laws, unlawful entry, and the process required for an HOA to address maintenance issues without infringing on owners' rights. Armed with this knowledge, I drafted a formal letter to the HOA board. In it, I asserted my property rights, demanded the immediate removal of Karen from my boathouse, and requested written confirmation that no HOA members would enter my property without prior consent. The letter also warned that any future unauthorized entry would be treated as trespassing, subject to legal action. The HOA's response was predictably defensive, claiming their actions were within their scope of duty, but they failed to provide any legal basis or authorization for Karen's occupation of my boathouse. By establishing my legal position clearly and professionally, I was not only defending my own property, but setting a precedent to protect other homeowners from similar abuses. This chapter was about reclaiming control through knowledge. Understanding my rights and the boundaries of HOA authority was crucial in this fight. Karen had assumed she could overstep without consequences. I was determined to show her otherwise. After firmly establishing my legal rights, it became increasingly clear that Karen's actions weren't an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern within the HOA. The organization, which should serve and protect the interests of homeowners, was instead overstepping its authority, often under the guise of community standards enforcement. HOAs are granted specific powers by state law and community agreements, but these powers come with clear limits. Their job is to maintain shared spaces, enforce agreed-upon rules, and resolve disputes fairly. What I experienced was the opposite, an overreach that blurred the lines between governance and personal intrusion. Karen, emboldened by her position on the HOA board, appeared to believe she could take matters into her own hands, entering private property without notice, making unilateral decisions, and ignoring homeowners' rights. This was a dangerous precedent. Digging deeper, I discovered other residents had similar complaints: fines without proper warnings, unauthorized inspections, and even pressure tactics that bordered on harassment. The HOA seemed to operate without transparency, accountability, or respect for due process. I began attending HOA meetings to better understand their operations. What I found was a board resistant to criticism, often dismissive of homeowners' concerns. Decisions were sometimes made behind closed doors with little input from the community. This lack of oversight created a climate where individuals like Karen could act unchecked, mistaking HOA authority for personal power. I realized that to protect not just my property but the entire neighborhood, it was essential to challenge the HOA's culture of overreach. Using my experience in law enforcement, I advocated for clearer policies, transparency, and respect for homeowners' rights. I pushed for the establishment of an independent review board to handle disputes impartially. The fight against the HOA's overreach wasn't just about one boathouse. It was about restoring balance and fairness to community governance. This chapter underscores the danger when those entrusted with authority forget their limits, and the necessity of vigilance from all residents. Once word spread about Karen moving into my boathouse without permission, the neighborhood's reaction was swift and mixed. Some residents stood firmly with me, recognizing the blatant abuse of HOA authority. Others hesitated, wary of rocking the boat or siding against a powerful board member. And a few openly supported Karen, convinced that the HOA was just trying to maintain order. At the first neighborhood gathering after the incident, I saw the spectrum of opinions clearly. Several longtime neighbors approached me privately, sharing their own stories of unfair fines, mysterious inspections, or arbitrary rule enforcement. They were frustrated but often felt powerless to challenge the board. Until now. With their support, I began forming a coalition of concerned residents willing to stand up for their rights. We exchanged ideas, pooled resources, and planned a united front to bring transparency and fairness back to the HOA. However, not everyone was on board. A faction of HOA loyalists accused me of stirring unrest, undermining the community spirit, and exaggerating the situation. Some neighbors warned me that pushing too hard could backfire, leading to social isolation or retaliatory actions. The tension was palpable. Social events became battlegrounds where friendly conversations turned into veiled debates about loyalty, authority, and property rights. Karen herself was often the center of whispered conversations, praised by some as a vigilant guardian of community standards, vilified by others as an overbearing enforcer. Navigating this divided landscape required patience and diplomacy. I focused on facts, maintaining professionalism, and emphasizing our shared goal, a fair and respectful neighborhood where everyone's rights were protected. At the same time, I remained vigilant against any attempts to intimidate or discredit me personally. As police chief, I was accustomed to scrutiny, but this was different. It was personal, played out within the community I called home. The mixed reactions highlighted a broader issue. In many communities, HOA power dynamics can create divisions that pit neighbors against each other, fracturing the very sense of community they're supposed to foster. But with growing support and clear evidence, our coalition gained momentum. We planned to address the HOA board directly, armed with the voices and stories of many residents. This chapter captures the complexity of community dynamics. How standing up for what's right often means confronting not just authority, but divided loyalties among friends and neighbors. It also reinforces that change begins when people come together, despite their differences, united by a common cause. After realizing that this situation with Karen and the HOA wasn't just about a one-time trespass, I knew that solid evidence would be essential for any legal or administrative action. Words and accusations would only get me so far. To protect my property and my rights effectively, I needed to document everything thoroughly and professionally. The first step was securing my boathouse. I installed new locks and added security cameras aimed at the entrance and surrounding area. These cameras weren't just for surveillance, they provided concrete proof of any unauthorized entry or suspicious activity. Over the next few weeks, I reviewed the footage regularly. There were several instances where Karen or other HOA members approached the boathouse without prior notice, often lingering longer than necessary. One particularly revealing video showed Karen bringing personal belongings into the boathouse, reinforcing that she intended to stay there, not just inspect or maintain. I also kept a detailed log of all communications with the HOA, emails, letters, phone calls, and messages, noting times, dates, and responses. This record became invaluable, demonstrating my consistent efforts to resolve the matter amicably and legally. Neighbors contributed too. Some who had witnessed Karen's presence or related incidents came forward, providing statements and even sharing their own security footage. The collective documentation painted a clear picture of a pattern of intrusion and overreach. I shared the evidence with my attorney, who helped me prepare a formal complaint outlining the trespassing and property rights violations. This documentation wasn't just for legal proceedings. It was a tool to hold the HOA accountable and protect other residents from similar abuses. By presenting irrefutable evidence, I strengthened my position and forced the HOA to take the issue seriously. They could no longer dismiss my claims as mere personal grievances or misunderstandings. Gathering evidence was a critical turning point. It shifted the conflict from a he said, she said scenario into a matter of undeniable facts. It also empowered me. Knowing I had the proof to back up my rights gave me confidence to push forward. In this chapter, I detail the meticulous process of collecting and organizing evidence, the challenges involved, and how it changed the course of the battle over my boathouse. After months of escalating tension, evidence gathering, and failed attempts at negotiation, it became clear that the HOA would not voluntarily back down. Karen continued to push boundaries, emboldened by the apparent support of certain board members. It was time to leverage my position as police chief, not to intimidate, but to protect my rights and uphold the law. Being the chief gave me a unique vantage point. I understood the legal framework better than most and had access to resources and personnel that could assist if the situation deteriorated further. But I also knew that mixing my official authority with a personal dispute could be tricky. I needed to maintain professionalism and transparency. I informed my department of the ongoing HOA conflict and asked for discreet assistance in monitoring the property and documenting any potential trespassing. I assigned trusted officers to patrol the area regularly, making sure any HOA attempts at unauthorized entry would be met with a lawful response. When Karen attempted to re-enter my boathouse one evening, this time bringing a contractor without my permission, officers were on site promptly. They informed Karen of the trespassing laws and the need for prior consent. This intervention wasn't about personal vendetta. It was a clear enforcement of property rights and the law. Moreover, I used my position to educate the HOA board during a formal meeting about their legal limits and the consequences of overreach. I emphasized that while HOAs have important roles, they do not have the right to circumvent legal processes or invade private property. Some board members bristled, but many listened. My dual role as resident and law enforcement leader lent weight to the message. However, I was careful to separate my official duties from the personal dispute, ensuring no conflicts of interest arose. Transparency was key. I disclosed the situation to city officials and my department to avoid accusations of abuse of power. The involvement of law enforcement made it clear that any future violations would carry real consequences. Karen's boldness diminished, and the HOA began to tread more cautiously. This chapter reveals how I balanced authority and professionalism to protect my rights, enforce the law, and push back against HOA overreach, all while maintaining my integrity as police chief. After months of confrontation, legal wrangling, and involving law enforcement, it was clear that continuing the fight without dialogue would only prolong the conflict and fracture the community further. While standing firm was necessary, I also recognized the value of mediation, a structured negotiation to seek common ground and resolve the dispute peacefully. I proposed mediation to the HOA board, suggesting an impartial third party facilitate discussions between me and Karen, as well as other relevant board members. The goal was straightforward: clarify boundaries, establish respectful communication, and agree on policies that protect both homeowners' rights and the community's standards. Reluctantly, the HOA agreed. The mediation sessions were tense. Karen remained defensive, still convinced that her actions were justified for the good of the neighborhood. Other board members oscillated between support for Karen and acknowledgement that procedures had been mishandled. I laid out my concerns clearly. Unauthorized entry was a violation of property rights, and HOA enforcement must respect due process. I also expressed willingness to collaborate on maintenance issues, provided they were handled with transparency and respect. The mediator helped us explore practical solutions. One key agreement was to establish clear notification protocols. Any inspections or maintenance requiring property access would involve prior written consent from homeowners. We also agreed to create a community oversight committee, including residents unaffiliated with the HOA board, to review enforcement actions and fines. This committee would ensure fairness and prevent unilateral decisions like Karen's intrusion. While not everyone was fully satisfied, the mediation marked a turning point. It opened channels of communication that had been closed and laid groundwork for more respectful interactions moving forward. Importantly, it diffused some of the personal animosity, focusing attention back on community well-being rather than power struggles. This chapter shows how mediation, despite its challenges, can break deadlocks and build pathways to compromise, even in situations charged with emotion and history. It's a reminder that sometimes standing your ground also means knowing when to listen and negotiate for the greater good. Following the mediation and the agreements reached, the next challenge was rebuilding trust within the neighborhood. The years of tension, accusations, and misunderstandings had left many residents feeling wary, divided, and uncertain about the future of our community. Reconciliation wouldn't happen overnight, but it started with small, consistent actions, showing respect, transparency, and a willingness to engage honestly. I organized several neighborhood events, barbecues, lakeside gatherings, and community cleanups that encouraged residents to come together in a relaxed setting, away from the disputes and formal meetings. These social opportunities helped people reconnect as neighbors, not adversaries. At HOA meetings, I continued to advocate for transparency, pushing for open minutes, accessible documentation of decisions, and clear channels for residents to voice concerns without fear of retaliation. Karen and I maintained a professional relationship, occasionally crossing paths during meetings and community functions. While not friends, we respected the boundaries we had established and the shared goal of improving the neighborhood. Other residents began to step forward to serve on the newly formed Oversight Committee, demonstrating a commitment to fairness and balanced governance. Slowly, the narrative shifted from the police chief versus the HOA to a story about a community learning to uphold its values while respecting individual rights. Trust was fragile but growing. Personally, I reflected on the experience and realized that leadership isn't just about authority or enforcement. It's about listening, understanding diverse perspectives, and fostering cooperation. This chapter captures the ongoing journey of healing and the importance of community resilience. It underscores that even the toughest conflicts can be a catalyst for positive change when approached with patience, integrity, and an open heart. Reflecting on this whole ordeal, from Karen's unexpected intrusion into my boathouse to the complex battle with the HOA, I've come away with some hard-earned lessons about authority, rights, and community. First, knowing your rights inside and out is critical. Even as police chief, I had to take a deep dive into property law and HOA regulations to fully understand where the boundaries lay. Knowledge is power, and it's the first step in protecting yourself. Second, authority must be exercised responsibly and within limits. Karen's assumption that HOA status gave her carte blanche to invade private property was misguided and illegal. It's a reminder that power, no matter the source, must be checked by respect and legality. Third, conflict within communities is inevitable, but how we handle it shapes the outcome. I learned the value of combining firmness with diplomacy, standing strong against overreach, but remaining open to dialogue and compromise. Fourth, evidence and documentation matter. Without solid proof of the HOA's intrusions, my claims might have been dismissed. Meticulous records provided the foundation for effective action. Fifth, leadership is multifaceted. Balancing my role as police chief and a private citizen demanded careful navigation to avoid conflicts of interest while leveraging my knowledge and position to defend my rights. Finally, community resilience comes from unity and trust. The divisions sown by this dispute are healing because people chose to come together, prioritize respect, and work toward shared goals. This experience was more than a personal battle. It was a lesson in justice, governance, and neighborliness. Moving forward, I'm committed to maintaining these principles, not just for myself, but for the entire neighborhood. I'm hopeful that our community will emerge stronger, fairer, and more connected because of it. To anyone facing similar disputes, educate yourself, stand your ground, but seek understanding. The path to resolution isn't always easy, but it's worth it.